So, sounds like everybody can hear me. That's good. All right. My name's Mike Earley, and today I am obviously doing a presentation on CSS Flexbox. I'd like to get a quick gauge in the room, and if you've heard of Flexbox before, go ahead and raise your hand and just keep it up for me for a second. All right, that's awesome. 2 years ago would not have been the case. Now, for those folks that had their hands raised for I have heard of CSS Flexbox, have you used it? So keep your hand raised if you've used CSS Flexbox. So I don't know if you guys look around, right? I can literally count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people out of maybe, I don't know, 100 plus. CSS Flexbox has actually been around for, well, since 2011, but really in practice probably since mid-2012, 2013, which is about how long I've been using it. I started using it in, I think, late 2012, and I've been using it since then. I cannot put my presentation in presenter mode because for whatever reason Apple decided that meant I no longer want to be able to swipe my desktops left and right. And since today's presentation for me is a combination of some information in the slides, a demonstration of what that looks like, and the code behind it, I do need to be able to swipe, which means you get to see the frames in Keynote. So I apologize for that. Anyway, I probably need to display these slides apparently. There we go. Okay. So what is CSS Flexbox? CSS Flexbox is a level 3 specification, which means that it's part of the CSS 3 specification, I guess you'd say, for lack of a better term. It's the way that W3 does that stuff, I think, is kind of loosey-goosey personally, but it's technically a level 3 specification. It's on maybe its 6th or 7th iteration at this point, is not considered a final specification. It's still, an ongoing specification. And what it does is really two things. At a container level, which is to say, if you have an HTML div element, and that HTML div element has children, you can control the horizontal, vertical, and ordinal placement of those children within that div element. But the second thing that it does is it allows you to control how those children size themselves, whether they size themselves at all, expand, shrink, etc. And what that translates to, by the way, is CSS Flexbox has been built for responsive design and responsive development. What I'm going to do today is I've gone ahead and I used Google Inbox as a framework. Basically, I recreated Google Inbox's main page in HTML, so none of this stuff actually clicks and works. There's nothing that actually works within here, obviously. But I've gone ahead and created the site within there. And what we're going to be able to do in today's session is we're going to go from this. So on the left, you've got the unflexboxed version of Google Inbox. And on the right, you've got the unflexboxed version of Google Inbox narrowed down in size, right, to see our responsiveness. And what we'll end up with at the end is we'll end up with flexboxed versions of these things where the only changes I'll have made to the HTML structure is to add in the various flexbox properties. In this case, I'm implementing them by way of flex classes. You'll see that in a second. And this is what we'll end up with. Obviously, these aren't perfect. I did not try to make them work 100% like Google Inbox. I could have spent another probably 10 hours making that work. So, some things that should disappear don't disappear, and that's fine. It serves its purpose for what we're going to be doing. So that's what we're going to be doing today. How I've done this for the purposes of this demonstration, but also, by the way, this is how I always implement CSS Flexbox is to create a series of classes that implement the flex properties. It kind of creates almost a natural language feel to it. So for example, if I'm creating a container that I want to be a reverse columnar flex container, then I would say flex is column reverse. And those two classes together would apply that functionality to that div container, and we would be off and running with that. The reason I do that, the reason that my team and I have done that at Cardinal Health, and I'll spend a second talking about who I am and where I'm from, by the way, in 1 second. The reason we've done that is it actually makes it very easy for not only myself and my coworker who do the HTML and CSS work, but also our developers doing the JavaScript work to very quickly modify HBS files, add these classes in, and reload screens and see the effects that it's going to have without necessarily having to go into like a container-specific class and add things to that, and then add things to another one, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a speedier framework for us to use for implementing Flexbox functionality. That's how we've done it. So just a quick pause. I did skip by this in a little bit of nervousness. I work at Cardinal Health. I work in our commercial technologies division, which we also go by the moniker of the Fuse. And some of you may have already passed by it. There's a booth, I guess it's this way. Right when you come in the door and you turn to the right, there's a booth, there's a little Plinko game, and you can win some candy and free movie tickets and little Fuse beer glasses and everything. What we do at Fuse is we do probably what most of the folks in here are doing, which is agile development, whether it's Scrum or some other agile methodology. It depends on the day or depends on the team. We're doing agile development. We're using a lot of the modern frameworks, Ember, Angular, Backbone. And what I do specifically there, I wear a lot of hats. I do user experience work, so research and interaction design from that element. I do visual design, so I do a lot of illustrations and graphics and things like that. But I also do front-end web development, specifically HTML and CSS, although I do get into some of the JavaScript as well when I need to screw something up that somebody else has done correctly. So I don't know if Dan and Brian are in here, but they probably know what I'm talking about with that. So that's really what I do there. We have an application that when I got hired there, I started working on that actually worked on a 480 by 640 display, fixed display. And the whole interface had been built with just some horrifying series of floats and position absolutes and just things that make me cry, because when I went to try and change something or add something, it completely broke the interface. Nothing worked. I had to recode every page anytime I wanted to do something. So almost immediately upon getting into that mess, I said, no, this isn't going to work. We're going to switch this out. We're not going to use this stuff anymore. And we started using CSS Flexbox instead. More recently, actually about exactly a year ago, we rewrote that application. We switched it from Dojo to Ember, which was an enormous, enormous gain on its own. But we also completely wrote a new CSS framework from scratch for it. And we wrote that framework using CSS Flexbox from a layout perspective. There are no floats in this application. There are very few position absolutes, only when they're necessary. They're still necessary in some instances. There's no grid system. Everything is done via CSS Flexbox. Within the past 6 months, we had to take that 640 by 480 and we had to explode it out to be able to run on 1024s and 1280s and all these different positioned screens. And so we were able to easily implement that because we'd done CSS Flexbox, and we just had to add in some media queries and say, when you're at this media query size, increase it to this, increase it to that, whatever. So that's just kind of a rundown of my experience and what we've been doing with CSS and with Flexbox in particular. And I apologize for inserting that mid explanation. So this is the framework that we're using, and you'll see it in the code when we start looking at the code. but I do have an example. So this example here is a Flex container, and this Flex container is up at the top. You see the today on the left and the little check mark with the dashes on the right, which in Google's methodology means that you're checking multiple things. I don't know who picked that icon because that's not at all what it means to me, but that's what it means. And so what I'm showing here in this diagram is simply how CSS is being applied from a Flexbox perspective to make everything do what it's doing. So very first, the application of the class Flex tells us to make that outer container, which the outer container is the light gray rectangle. It says, make this container a Flex container. So instead of display block, which because it's a div, that would be its default display block, we're going to use display Flex instead. Now there's also an option display inline Flex. I'm not going to really get into that today. Feel free to Google it and look into it, but it works similarly to Flex, except that it behaves. Flex works. A flexible box is itself a block element whose children are treated differently. So an inline Flex element is an element that is treated as an inline element instead of a block element, but treats its children differently. So that's basically what it does. Okay, space between. So space between is our shorthand for justify content. Justify content is the CSS Flexbox property that allows you to determine how the content is distributed across what they call the main axis of a container. What is the main axis of a container? Basically, in this instance, it's the width of this container. I'll explain that in a second. So space between says, take your children and put them at either end of the container that you're in and fill the remaining space with whatever empty space you have for that container. So that's what you see here. We have another class, align center. This is a cross-axis class. Again, I'll explain that in a second. And simply what it says is align everything in this cross-axis class along the center point of that axis. A bit of an oddity, when we coded our application, we noticed when we started converting our old CSS framework to our new CSS framework that, 70% of our Flex containers were Flex direction column. And so what we did when we implemented our Flex class, and you probably saw it a second ago, is that we set the Flex direction to column. So that just saved us a little bit of class typing later on. What you then see in this example is that we've reversed it and said, no, we actually want this to be a row, not a column. Okay, so a few explanations on CSS Flexbox terminology that I just threw out there. First off, basically, if you think of a rectangle, with CSS Flexbox, you're going to specify whether the height of the rectangle is your main axis or the width of the rectangle is your main axis. And the way you do that is by specifying the flex direction. They've used what I think is confusing terminology. So, for example, this container, this Flex container, is a row Flex container. What that means is that its main axis is width. A different way to think of it is that when you tell a Flex container that its flex direction is a row, what you're telling it is that use one row and make all the children within columns. And vice versa, if you say flex direction is column, what you're telling it is to say the container is one column and the children within it are rows within that column. It feels completely backward to me, honestly. Like it feels like I'm doing an airplane simulator where the controls are in reverse, and for the first 5 minutes that you're flying on it, you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm crashing into the ground. So it's very unnatural to me, but you eventually figure it out. I actually have to say to myself a lot of the times, okay, I want multiple rows, so I need to say column. Or I want multiple columns, that means it needs to be a row. Again, it's really weird to me, but I get used to it eventually. So the main axis then is that flex direction, whether you're going row or column. And the cross axis, anyone want to make a wild guess at what the cross axis is? Anyone? The other direction, right? So in this instance, we've gone width, which means the cross axis is height. If we changed it to a column flex direction, the main axis would be height, the cross axis would be the width. So I think that covers those elements. So when we talk about the main axis, we set it with the flex direction, and we control its justification with the justify content property. When we talk about the cross axis is set by default by a flex direction, which is to say it's the opposite of whatever this flex direction that's been specified. And we align it or justify it using the align items class. There's another oddity with CSS Flexbox between justify content and align items in that they you don't totally have the same control with those two items. What it comes down to is that the cross axis, the main axis, because it's a block element, the main axis is controlled by its parents as well as its children. So the width of a container that hasn't had a specified width is controlled depending on the children that are inside of that container as well as the width that's been allowed to it by the parent of that container as well. But the height of that container usually is just dependent on the children of the container, or if you specify height property. What's interesting is that with the CSS Flexbox, your cross-axis, you're going to always end up having to specify if you want it to be a certain height or a certain width. You're going to have to say, you know what, I've got my flex container. It's a row, so it's one column with a bunch of it's one row with a bunch of columns inside it, backwards. And I want it to be this tall, so I need to size it, and I need to say its height is 480 pixels, so I go ahead and set that. There's actually another way to do that. We'll get into it later on. The point of that is just to say that when you get into justify content versus align items, you will notice some differences in behavior. They don't quite work the way I want them to work, I guess is how I'd say. So like when I think of Flexbox, I think of like Illustrator, and I want to be able to draw and define, the height and width all in one pass. And you kind of, it's just a little different with CSS Flexbox. You're not able to, they don't justify content, the main axis, and align items, the cross axis, don't exactly work the same way. Okay, so we already kind of saw a preview of this. What we're going to do, we're going to recreate the Google Inbox interface with the complete use of CSS Flexbox. So again, this interface, with the exception of the little pin button, the pin button uses absolute positioning. I think that's the only thing in here that uses absolute positioning. Everything else within this is using CSS Flexbox to get positioned. Or, in this instance, nothing is using Flexbox because I've removed all of it. What we'll do is we're going to go through 4 steps, and then we're going to go through a hidden 5th step. And the reason it's a hidden 5th step is because it talks about somewhat hidden functions of CSS Flexbox. So I was amusing myself when I did that. I apologize. It was amusing to me. If it's not amusing to you, yeah, whatever, it was my presentation. So what we'll do is we'll show what happens when we start applying Flexbox to these containers. Flex classes. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in the Flex class. We'll put in the justify content classes. We'll put in the align items classes. And then the flex direction classes if applicable, and you'll see how that starts to make the application kind of fall into order. The second thing we'll look at is we will look at the body, and specifically how we make the viewport, how we make the content fill the viewport using some of our flex terminology. The third phase is that we're going to get into flexing items. So when we talk about Flexbox, we have three things, even though they really only define two of them clearly. You have a flex container or a flex parent. I'll almost consistently refer to it as a flex container. This is your outer rectangle that you're putting all your crap in. It's the box. You have flex items or flex children. These are the direct descendants only of the flex container. So it's the objects that you're putting inside the box. And then the third item, which is our hidden fifth element that we'll talk about, is our flex lines. And flex lines are kind of like if you turned your box up on its side, they're the shelves, right? And we're putting objects, if you think of it as a shelving unit, if you think of a flex container as a shelving unit, and you're putting boxes on that shelving unit, when you fill a shelf, which is a flex line, you can either keep going outside of that shelf and put things somewhere else, or you can put them on the next shelf. And those are what flex lines are. Flex lines are horribly poorly documented, and they're really weird in how they work. To me, it's like a big miss on the part of the W3 org in terms of how they've implemented it. Fourth, we'll talk about wrapping and scrolling, and within that wrapping and scrolling conversation, I'll show you an example for the second time of how we can kind of size the content without having to specify the height of something, and then still also get scrolling content within it. So we'll look at that in the fourth step. Okay, one point that I want to illustrate on CSS Flex items, and this is something that confuses folks all the time, including myself. It is only the direct descendants, only the children of a Flex container that are Flex items. So if you have a three-level div, you have a div Flex container, and you have a div Flex item inside of it, and that div Flex item has divs inside of it. Those divs inside of that Flex item they behave normally, in this case as block level elements. They do not have any of the properties of CSS Flexbox and how you control something with CSS Flexbox. So when we look at my code, you'll see lots of Flex classes, right? And that's because as we go deep within the containers, we want a container that has items in it, and we want those items to be Flex containers as well. So you end up with nested Flex containers, which is fine, works perfectly well. Okay, so as I already mentioned, what we're going to do in this step one is we'll go from adding Flex classes, Flex directions, justify content, and align items. Now there's a lot of HTML. I didn't want to sit here typing into a bunch of HTML and bore everybody. So what I've done is I've actually prepared separate HTML files for each step that we're going to look at. So this right here is the step one, okay, and the after. So on the left, you've got what it looks like prior. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, let me, is that good? I don't know why you guys want to read it. I mean, what the heck, right? I have my glasses on, I can see it. Okay, yeah, thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you actually the difference between step one and step two. Okay, so here we are, and we look at the header element, for example, and you can see, yep, sorry, I'm going from it before to step one. Thank you, whoever said same thing. You're right, it was the same thing. Okay, so you can see here, let's try that, see if that'll keep it staying in. Okay, so you can see on the left, this is this version of the code, okay? And on the right, I've started to put in the Flex classes. So looking at header class, for example, you'll see that we added in Flex. So we've said, okay, make the children of the header class Flex container. We don't want it to be a column, we want it to be a row, meaning we want it to be columns within a row. We want to wrap the content within it. and we want to justify it by putting the first item on the left, the last item on the right, and distributing everything else in between, distributing the white space evenly. Finally, we want to align the content on the cross-axis on the center point. So what does that look like? So here we are, and magically, everybody close their eyes for 1 second. I'll type in all of the CSS into the classes in, right? And this is what it ends up looking like after I've added those flex classes. And again, just flex direction, justify content, align items. Those are the things I've added. That's the difference between before and step 1. My mother's calling me. Let me go ahead and decline that, sorry. There are times when you don't answer your mother's phone call. Apparently presenting is one of them. Okay, so huge difference, right? So we go from, blah, looks horrible, to, oh, okay, that starts to resemble something that might look like a layout. There's still problems, there's still stuff that doesn't look right, but it's much, much closer. I'm gonna split screen a little bit for a second here, and what you see, for example, on the left, this is the after version, right? This is after we've applied these classes. So before, it treated them all as block level elements, so you get them all one after the other. But then once we applied a flex direction as row, it went ahead and put them as columns in the opposite direction. Basically, it took these block elements within this flex container and treated them like inline block elements. It's effectively what it's doing. I'm going to expand this out a little bit, and what you'll see is that second row, the 4 icons on the second row, once I get to a certain width, they'll snap back up to the right side. We'll get into that when we get into talking about flex wrap, but that's what flex wrap does. Now, looking at this, there's still problems. There's still crap that looks weird. For example, this search field, we really want it to fill all of that available blue space there. There's no reason it shouldn't fill it, and that's how the Google inbox looks. It's filled. This is really weird. This I am presenting at Star Trek 2015 is all the way right aligned. I don't like that. I want it to be left aligned, so we'll look at fixing that as well. A couple things that we'll look at fixing. So, any questions so far? Yes, sir. That's a good question. The question is, does it play well with Bootstrap? Are there issues? Would you want to do that? Just one quick caveat before I talk about Bootstrap. Foundation for apps, which Foundation is the alternative to Bootstrap, right? Foundation and Bootstrap are the two big CSS frameworks. Foundation has split into Foundation for Sites and Foundation for Apps. Foundation for Sites is the old version of Foundation. It's meant for implementing like marketing websites and app websites and things like that. Foundation for Apps instead is built for actually building web applications, which is what I do, and it's probably what a lot of the folks in this room do, so it's a little bit more applicable. What's interesting about Foundation for Apps is that it is the first major CSS framework to use Flexbox as its layout system. So if I were choosing from scratch, I would choose Foundation for Apps because it's already using Flexbox. Having said that, Bootstrap uses a grid system, okay? Which the way grid systems work is that they effectively define columns on the page by setting width percentages. So if you say is thirds, then it sets width 33% and it puts margin paddings and all that crap on it, gutters. I hate grid systems, by the way. I absolutely hate them. Thank you. I refuse to use, I've learned grid systems. I refuse to use them. I can't stand them. And I realize that probably makes me an arrogant jackass, but I'm already an arrogant jackass, so there's no reason not to add more things onto the pile. Anyway, it uses a grid system. The grid defines the widths. Flexbox focuses on individual containers, individual elements, and the children of those elements. So you can absolutely use CSS Flexbox within Bootstrap. What you could do, but would be redundant, is you could take I mean, we've basically written out a block of CSS classes that are single property implementations of all the CSS Flexbox values, so that when we're coding, we can quickly add those to our HTML and get the end result. You could take that and you could build a whole Bootstrap interface where you use your Flexbox layout methodology instead of their grid methodology. You could do a 50-50 where only within certain containers within that grid methodology you use the Flexbox rules, because again, the Flexbox only deals with a container and the direct descendants in that container. So as a direct example, you could just make, let's say this was Bootstrap, okay? And you could just make this section right here a Flex container. You could just make the plus button a Flex container and manage that within that. There's absolutely nothing that's stopping you from doing that. It can be very micro in its implementation. Again, I mentioned earlier when we redid our application at Cardinal Health, before we just completely rewrote it from scratch, I did have to actually kind of shoehorn in Flex objects into existing floats and noise like that I wanted to shoot. So certainly you can implement Flexbox as small as a single container and as big as the whole website. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, so that would let you use the other parts of Bootstrap.
That's right. You would be able to utilize all the other parts of Bootstrap. I'm going to take this call. Just 1 second. This is my ex-wife now calling me. Okay. Hey, I am literally in the middle of a presentation. Can I call you back? You're on speaker with 150 people, so. Bye. There we go. Sorry, I apologize. I'm sure a lot of folks in here have children. My son is coming to see the Avengers with me after this is over. And he knows this, of course, and I have the extra ticket for him. And for whatever jackass reason, pardon, not saying my son's a jackass, he brought his best friend home with him. So what they're trying to do is call me and figure out whether the best friend should come to the movie with him. Of course, I have no idea because I don't have a ticket for him. So yeah, that's what they're calling me about. So I apologize. It's definitely a problem that needs to be dealt with. I don't know what to do. So anyway, that's why my mother and ex-wife are calling me. Okay, other questions that I can answer right now? Not about my son and his best friend? Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'll let them know that I have an extra ticket here real quick. If you guys just give me 30 seconds. Thank you very much, everybody. This is hilarious. All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody. That's right. Yeah. Let me just make a Skype phone call real quick. Okay. So I'm going to move on to step 2. Let me resize my windows back down to my perspectives here. Okay. Step 2. This is just an interesting thing. In step 1, you see I've got a little bit of a scroll effect, a little bit of a bouncy scroll effect, right? Which is an artifact of the way I have not applied a flex class. I have not fully defined how I want these containers to size within themselves. When we talk about flex items within a container, right? So for example, when we talk about this container has 2 flex items. It has the word today, which is a div, and it has this icon, which is a div. So when we talk about these flex items, we can control their flexibility, which is again where the name of Flexbox comes from, by specifying 3 different rules specifically within those flex items. And so as a quick step 2, a little trick that we can do to get the window to work the way we want is that we can set the HTML and body height to equal 100%. And then on the, so what I've done, let me show you what I've done, right? This full page here is 3 flex, so the body element is a flex container. I've made it a flex container. And the children are the header, which is the blue bar, the footer, which is just the plus button, but it occupies the full width of the page, and then the content section. And the content section is everything else in between the header and the footer. So the way I want this page to behave is I want the footer to stay at the bottom, I want the header to stay at the top, and I want the content section to fill the remaining available space. The way I do that in Flexbox is simply to tell that content container flex to fill the remaining available space. How do we do that? We do that with a CSS class. I've called it Flex1, okay, right here. So we've got Flex1, and what Flex1 does, obviously, is set the flex property to a value of 1. Now, the flex property is applicable to the flex items. It has 3 values within it: flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. I will explain those on a slide a little bit later. But what we do in step 2, so right now you see the scroll, we see the bounce. What you'll see here on step 2 is there's no more scroll, okay? It's because I've added flex 1 to that content section, what it's done is say, put, and it's a space between, the body is a space between flex containers. So it said, put the first line on the very top, put the last line on the very bottom. If there's another item, put it in the middle and distribute the space. So the content HTML element is the middle in this instance. And because I've applied a flex grow value of 1, or a flex 1, I've told it to fill the remaining available space instead of using white space to fill those areas, which is why now we no longer have that scroll that we see here. Okay, so that's a quick thing on step 2, really. So just the same thing on this side. You still see the exact same thing. It's that little bounce scroll and then no scroll. Okay, so on step 3, step 3 is where I started getting into the flex items. So again, we've got some classes here just as examples that we're going to add to things. Flex auto, flex none, flex 1. Let me walk through those. The flex property is a shorthand property. There are 2 shorthand properties in the CSS Flexbox box of tools. One of them is flex flow. I haven't actually used it. Flex flow is a combination of flex direction and flex wrap. I just use flex direction and flex wrap separately. I don't use flex flow. There's no good reason I don't use it. I just don't use it. I do, however, use the flex class shorthand, and again, I can't really explain to you why I don't use it in one instance and I do in the other, but there you go. So it is a shorthand for the flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis properties. Flex grow defines how an item, an individual child within a flex container, will expand itself to fill available space. Flex shrink defines how an object will shrink to as a container reduces in size. And flex basis is actually a direct map to width. So it uses the same values that the width property uses. So you can use none, you can use inherit, you can use a percentage value. You can't use all of the width values. Like I don't think you can use 100 VH, for example. You can't specify viewport height. But it takes none, auto, and percentage values. The default of the flex property, if none is specified, is 0, 0 auto, which means that it doesn't grow, it doesn't shrink, and its width is defined by its own contents, just like if you had specified width auto, the same thing. So flex none is a shorthand for, I believe, 0, 0 none, which is to say never change the sizing of this container. The sizing of this container is fixed. So it's a shorthand within a shorthand property, effectively. And flex1, in this instance, we've only used one value of the property. So we've only used the flexgrow property in this instance. I could have just as easily said flexgrow1, but I might want to come back to this later on and add the shrink and basis properties. So it does, theoretically give me the possibility of doing that, but it's really the same as saying flexgrow1. So looking at step 3, what you're going to see is you're going to see, I'm going to expand this a little bit because this is where you want to see the example. You're going to see this search box change, and you're going to see the contents within this change because I've added these properties that affect the individual items and define how they grow. Yes, sir?
How widely supported is Flexbox?
Sure. It is very widely supported across browsers. It's fully supported in Chrome. It's fully supported in Firefox. It's fully supported in Safari. I don't have internet access, so I can't pull up can I use right now. But older versions of, so Flexbox has this kind of weird history. It came out in 2011. It had this, this first version of this spec, and it was a dud. They didn't like it. They didn't like how they coded the language effectively. So it just sat there, and nobody really adopted it. Microsoft said, that shit's really cool. Apologize for my cussing. It's a great concept, and we can expand on this. So Microsoft actually made, in typical Microsoft fashion, a half-spec version of CSS, where they implemented their own rules and changed crap, which is, again, typical Microsoft. So you had that interstitial thing that Microsoft did. And then in 2013, they redid Flexbox, and so it's second considered iteration outside of the Microsoft thing. And that's when the browsers started implementing it. So the browsers started implementing it around 2013. So basically, any browser, any major browser 2013 and up is supporting Flexbox at this point. Like I said, I don't have can I use in front of me, and I'm on T-Mobile, which means I don't have internet service or phone service in here. So I'd look it up for you, but caniuse.com, it's very widely supported. It's really considered, I don't want to say that it's considered like, core at this point, but pretty much across all the browsers it's in there. That's a good question. Yes, sir?
I noticed you didn't say IE.
Yeah, well, so again, depending on the version of IE you're using, you get, like, if you go back to IE, I don't know, I'm going to say, let's say you go back to IE 8, you get that Microsoft weird-ass version. It's not, okay, so thank you. So I know that at some point they implemented, I don't know if it was 8 or 9. I'll be honest with you guys, I have not touched Microsoft CSS development since 2011. Thank you, I love it, it's great. So I don't have a great answer for that, but they do support it currently. I don't know what full fashion they support it in. The guy with the phone can probably look it up for us. Yes, sir.
And my last question is, mobile, pretty solid on the mobile browsers, mobile Safari?
I believe it is. Again, on the major ones, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and again, I don't know anything about Windows Phone, sorry. Right, right. So somebody here does, I'm sure. But yeah, look it up on Can I Use. I know it's pretty widely supported. It's a pretty widely supported spec at this point. And anybody on a phone that's not T-Mobile is more than welcome to correct me and tell me I'm wrong as they're looking that up. Other questions? Okay, all right, so everybody closes their eyes. I'm magically typing, clackety clack clack, and oh wow, that looks a lot better. So what we did from here to here is we basically, the blue header is a flex container, and we told this flex child that contains this search box, okay, let me show it to you. We told it to flex, and that is right here. So flex search container left flex auto. Flex auto means, again, in my code, set its flex grow to 1, flex shrink to 1, and width to automatic. And that's where we get this magic where it takes this search box and fills that available blue space with its content. Okay.
If you add that auto to more than one element in the row.
It evenly distributes them as best as it can. So if you have 3 containers and 2 of them have a grow value of 1, which is what's controlling, that's what's making this happen, and the third one doesn't have anything. The third one will stay its own size based off of the width we've specified, and the other 2 will equally size to fill available remaining space. Their ratios is what they effectively are. So if you wanted, you could set a flex grow to 2, a flex grow to 1, and then the third one would be flex grow 0. The third one wouldn't grow, and the other 2 would distribute the remaining space 2/3, 1/3. So that's how the flex grow property works, is it's a ratio based off of the children. And if you don't define, the flex grow is 0 by default, so they don't grow at all by definition. In fact, in this example, I'm going to expand it a little bit. I wish I was dealing with a wider resolution. This object right here does not grow. This object does not grow. This object grows, and it contains the little pin icon. And then these objects over here don't grow. Okay. I got about 15 minutes left. We're doing pretty well. Step 4 deals with wrapping and overflow. So we're going to add a little bit of content in step 4, which is the after step. So you can see I've added a couple new rows, but I've also added a scrolling container. Well, how does that work? Besides the JavaScript that makes the scrolling container work. How does it work? Basically, this updates outer box, again, is a flex container, but it's within a larger flex container. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up the inspector for this. I think that'll help us see it a little bit better. And that is useless. Okay, we're gonna have to deal with what we got, folks, sorry. Okay, so this outer container right here, okay, that is a flex container. You see it right here, flex class is right there. I don't know how well, is that even readable? Thank you. Okay, is that better? Okay, thank you. So we've got this flex class on that outer group. Within that outer group, we have 1, 2, 3 children. And those 3 children right now, because I haven't specified any flex grow, flex shrink values on them, they're just evenly sized and they're not filling the available remaining space. When we click on this, however, it's switching divs. What it's doing is it's hiding the div that was there and displaying this other div. This other div, I've applied a class of flex1 to. So now what we've done is we've taken this box that, if you think of this box, there we are. Right now, this box is capable of growing all the way to the bottom of the viewport, okay? But it's not doing that because we haven't told it to do that. So the boxes are just staying their natural sizes. By adding the property of flex1 to one of the children, so a flex grow value of 1, we've expanded one of the children to fill available remaining space. And so it's pushed it all the way down to the bottom of where it's allowed to go, which is ending at the footer there. Now, depending on what you set for your overflow value, you can then scroll the content within that container if you so choose. This, by the way, is not how Google Inbox works. I did that for the purposes of this demonstration, not to duplicate Google Inbox. So if we were to turn flex scroll, just to show you some examples, Yeah, here we go. So if we change our overflow value to, what are the options here? Hidden, then we come over here and you can see that I can't scroll to those additional, it's hidden the scroll box, right? If we change it to inherit, there's no scroll. Initial, what initial does is it fully sizes it, but it still leaves the other two items at the point where they're supposed to stay. So that's a bit of an interesting oddity that obviously we wouldn't want. Overlay allows you to scroll those items. Scroll allows you to scroll those items. And visible does basically the same thing as, I think, inherit. So anyway, just to give you an idea of how you can set these objects and play around with them, to allow yourself to take a flex container within a page and kind of just individually control what's going on within it. The important thing I wanted to show with this demonstration is that I did not, when I initially coded this, this outer gray box, I set its height to 480 pixels. And then I sat there thinking about it, and I'm like, no, I don't need to do that. I just need to set it to flex grow 1. I don't care what the size is. So if I had set it to 480 pixels, I wouldn't be able to do this, which is that when I shrink this container, it's automatically resizing that gray box to fit available remaining space without having to change, without having media queries, without having to change widths, min heights, any of that crap. It just automatically contains itself and scrolls its own contents. I think that's really cool. We use that a lot within what we do. Okay, so 10 minutes here. Step 5, the invisible step, deals with documentation. So I mentioned earlier that with Flexbox we deal with 3 things: flex container, flex item, and flex line. Flex line is not actually, you can't define a flex line. So a flex child is automatically a direct descendant of a flex container. It's automatically defined. You don't have to further define it. It inherits its child nature from the fact that it's the direct descendant of a flex container. The flex line, however, only exists under certain conditions. It only exists if the container is set to wrap. So you can wrap or not wrap the contents of a container. What does that look like? Let me show you what that looks like. We'll close that. We'll come here, and we'll come back to this inspector. And within this inspector right here for the header, I'm going to remove my flex wrap class. And what you'll see is that now it's tried to jam everything within the one row that we've given it the opportunity to use. So that's what flex wrap does. In this instance, because we haven't set any flex properties on any of these things, what it's basically done is it's basically taken all of them and tried to make them fit fully. And so it's shrunk them all, it's crammed them all up, or it's pushed things off border. It does all kinds of weird crap. So that's what that flex wrap. So first off, you have to have flex wrap. Second off, you actually have to have more than one line as a result of flex wrapping. So you don't have flex lines unless you have 2 or more lines. So it's got to be a flex container, it's got to have wrap, and it's got to have 2 lines. What does that look like? That looks like this. So this third thing I just threw in here because I wanted a really strong visual representation of what's going to look like. These containers, this white outer container and the red children within it, meet the criteria for flex lines. In other words, this row right here is a flex line, and this row right here is a flex line. And therefore, we can use the one property that applies to flex lines only when flex lines exist, which is align content. So the align content property allows us to control, and I'm going to show it to you from this inspector so that I have a little more space, how it distributes the layout of those objects based off of that flex align content. So you see right here, I've set a class of content stretch. So all of those objects, each one's object 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, they're identical in the CSS. They don't have widths or heights spec'd on them. So their widths are auto based off of the content of those items, which is to say, in this case, the text. They're all the same size if it were a normal block element page, if it were not a flex container. So if we were to remove, come on, there we go. If we were to remove the flex class, they're just normal objects, right? We add the flex class, all of a sudden they're treated as flex objects. What it's done is it's, because I've said stretch, is it's positioned them just evenly, it's distributed them evenly, and then it got to the third row and said, oh crap, I don't have 3, I only have 2. Still distribute them evenly, so it split them 50-50. If we look at the different options we have on the align content, so just watch the red boxes, okay? When we choose, let's see, they should be changing, but what am I doing? Oh, wait, hold on. I already have this spec, I thought. I did, yeah. Okay, this was working like 30 minutes ago, I swear. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm going to try this on the other side here. I don't know what I've done wrong. What will happen is that these objects will swim around dependent on how we've spec'd the content value. It's not doing it for some reason, and I don't know what I've miscoded. So I apologize. I'm not going to try and solve it here. I don't have time. So what would happen if we had align content center? What it would do is it would actually, these object 1 and object 2 would remain their natural sizes. They'd be the small boxes, and they'd be positioned on the center axis. Yes, sir?
So you're implying that this property only has a visual effect when you have more than one line, but my understanding of this property is that it would still have an effect on a single line if that single line didn't naturally fill up the entire space.
It does not.
Are you sure?
I am positive. In fact,
How do you decide how much space is between each of those elements? Whether that space between expands or whether elements expand?
so I don't know. I don't know if this will. Okay, so this is Dash. I use a little app called Dash, which downloads dictionaries for different languages, including CSS. The CSS align content property has second sentence has no effect on single line flexible boxes. This is why I don't like this property because it's wonky. Basically, you have to use a combination of the align items and the align content properties in order to get these things to work. And it only works if you have multiple lines, but you don't know whether you're going to have multiple lines or not because you don't know what size the user is going to make their browser. It's not well done, in my opinion. So that is flex lines. Since I gotta wrap it up here, they're a pain in the ass. I'm gonna upload this to GitHub and to SlideShare. I did not have a chance to do that because I had no internet connection today. There's my email addresses. Either one will work just fine. My Twitter and my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to contact me through any of those. Are there any other questions? What I wanted to do today was not to do like a Flexbox 101. Look, I can horizontally and vertically center this object. I wanted to actually show an implementation of an actual website where the whole website was done in Flexbox, and we've seen all of the rules in action, all of it done through Flexbox. Hopefully I accomplished that. If I didn't, I apologize. I got a couple minutes for questions. Yes, sir.
So have you worked with, you mentioned briefly view height and Flexbox. Have you done much with VWs or VHs?
I don't use them, and the reason I don't use them is because when you resize the browser, you have to refresh the page to get them to readjust. In other words, the way they've implemented viewport height and viewport width, so on a width CSS property, there are some new experimental values. You can say, instead of saying 100%, you can say 100% of viewport height, 100 VH. And what that means is that take the total height of the viewport, if it's 1,000 pixels, and use 70% of that 1,000 pixels for the height of this box, 700 pixels. If you then resize that viewport to 900 pixels, that box that you have the 70 VH on stays at 700 pixels until you refresh the browser. Then it'll adjust down to 630 or whatever. Have they updated it? See, I stopped using it because of that, because it wasn't, to me, it wasn't usable. So it's good to hear that they've updated that. That's awesome. It's because it's awesome. It's a great concept if it does it automatically without having to refresh the browser. Other questions? No? No? Well, I think I'm right on the nose at 4:30, so thank you.